The Mafia Boss was finishing an expensive meal at the city's most exclusive restaurant when he felt a sudden, sharp tug at his throat. It wasn't a garrote or a hidden blade. It was a pair of small, trembling hands gripping his black silk tie. Kaito-chan looked down. A little girl in a modest gray dress stood before him, her long brown hair straight and neat, but her eyes filled with a terrifying level of resolve. "One of your guys," she whispered, her voice cutting through the sudden silence of the dining room. "He injured my mama." His enforcers moved instantly, chairs scraping against the floor, their hands reaching for their jackets. But Kaito raised a tattooed hand, the silver of his luxury watch catching the candlelight as he signaled them to stand down. No one touched Kaito-chan without permission, and certainly no one pulled his tie. He leaned forward, the dark ink on his neck flexing as he looked her in the eye. "What do you want, kid?" She didn't let go of the silk. "I want you to make it right," she said, "because the police said they can't touch your people." That made him freeze. She leaned closer, her knuckles white as she gripped the fabric. "They told my mama that if she told anyone, they'd come back for me." That's when Kaito noticed the bruising on her small wrists and the absolute lack of fear in her gaze. The Mafia Boss didn't pull away. Instead, he settled back into his chair, not because he was being forced, but because he realized his own men had committed the one sin his code wouldn't allow. "Stay with me until the end, because the justice this little girl demanded next shocked even a man who had built an empire on blood." Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's get started. Kaito-chan had commanded the territory with a cold, calculated hand for years. The restaurant was a cathedral of glass and gold, a place where the city's elite paid for the privilege of feeling untouchable. At the center of it all sat Kaito-chan. He was a man carved from granite and shadow, his rugged build filling out a tailored black suit that cost more than most men made in a year. His dark hair was slicked back with military precision, and his beard was groomed to a sharp, intimidating edge. As he leaned back, the dark tattoos crawling up the side of his neck and over the backs of his hands seemed to pulse under the dim chandelier light. Every movement he made was a study in controlled power, punctuated by the cold glint of his silver luxury watch and the heavy ring on his finger, symbols of a status bought with blood and maintained through absolute silence. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the neighborhood existed in a different reality. It was a world Kaito had ruled for years with a cold, calculated hand. As his black Cadillac sat idling at the curb, the streets were unnaturally quiet. Shop owners didn't just look away. They hurried to lock their doors, and mothers pulled their children closer to the shadows as his enforcers passed. Fear was the air they breathed, a thick, stifling atmosphere that ensured the dragon's peace was never disturbed. Inside the restaurant, the staff moved like ghosts, their hands trembling as they poured wine, never daring to meet Kaito's gaze. Kaito's men, Tony and Marco, stood like stone sentinels near the entrance, their eyes scanning the room with the predatory gaze of human shields. They were the physical manifestation of his reach, ensuring that even in his moments of leisure, the threat of his wrath remained absolute. This was Kaito's kingdom, a realm of silk and steel where everyone knew the rules. You paid on time, you stayed quiet, and you never, under any circumstances, approached the dragon's table. Yet, as Kaito raised a glass of vintage red, the air in the room shifted. The heavy doors swung open, and instead of a dignitary or a rival, a small figure in a modest gray dress stepped into the light. The neighborhood's fear didn't seem to reach her. She walked with a terrifying level of resolve, her small shoes clicking against the marble floor until she stood directly before him. The enforcers tensed, ready to erase the disruption. But Kaito found himself frozen, his gaze locked on the little girl who dared to look the dragon in the eye. The silence in the restaurant was no longer a sign of respect. It was a vacuum, thick with the scent of expensive wine and the sudden, sharp ozone of impending violence. Kaito felt the silk of his tie tighten against his throat, as Mina's small fingers refused to let go. He stared down at her, the dark tattoos on his hands resting motionless on the white linen, while his men hovered like shadows ready to strike. The silver of his luxury watch glinted in the candlelight, a reminder of the wealth built on a foundation that was currently being accused of rot. "Tell me," Kaito said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that vibrated through the silk she held. Mina's voice was small, but it didn't tremble. She spoke of a Tuesday evening that had started with the smell of scorched rice and the sound of the rain against their window. Sora Park had been counting the few bills she'd set aside for rent when the door to their small apartment didn't just open. It exploded. Mina described the men who entered, Kaito's men, wearing the same cold, predatory expressions as the guards currently standing by the restaurant doors. They hadn't come for a conversation. They had come for a collection on a debt that Sora insisted had been settled months ago. The little girl's grip on his tie tightened as she described the cruelty that followed. When Sora had reached for her phone to call for help, one of the men hadn't just stopped her. He had used the heavy, cold metal of his ringed hand to strike her across the face. Mina watched from behind the tattered sofa as her mother was thrown against the wall, her modest dress tearing as she fell. The man with a jagged scar across his eyebrow had laughed. Mina said, even as Sora lay on the floor, her arm twisted at an angle that looked sickeningly wrong. They had trashed the small room, breaking the only lamp they owned, before leaning over her mother to whisper a final, jagged threat. If a single word reached the authorities, they would come back for the girl in the gray dress. Kaito felt a cold, familiar anger settle in his gut, but it wasn't directed at the child. It was a violation of his own code, the rule number 1, that forbade his organization from spilling the blood of the innocent. As Mina finished her story, she didn't look away. Her eyes were wide, searching his rugged, bearded face for a flicker of the monster she had been told he was. Instead, she found a man frozen by the realization that his own empire was being run by cowards who hid behind his name to bruise the helpless. The entire restaurant watched, breathless, as the dragon leaned closer to the girl, the air between them heavy with a debt that $5 could never cover. Kaito remained motionless, the weight of the girl's small hands still anchoring him to the table. Around him, the opulent restaurant felt suddenly hollow, the gold leaf and crystal mirror gilding on a structure that had begun to crumble from the inside. He looked down at the silver ring on his finger, an heirloom passed down from a father who had built this empire on a foundation of ironclad honor. His father's voice echoed in the chambers of his memory, a low rasp reciting the one commandment that stood above all others. Rule number 1. We are the shields of this city, not its predators. Never touch the innocent. To Kaito, that rule wasn't just a guideline. It was the boundary that separated a man of honor from a common thug. He had spent 15 years maintaining his reputation as a man of his word, a leader who kept the streets orderly and the problems silent. But as he stared into Mina's defiant brown eyes, he saw the mirror of his own failure. He had become so insulated by his luxury watches, his tailored suits, and the constant, reverent distance of his subordinates that he had stopped looking at what his name was being used for in the shadows. The realization was a cold, bitter draft. His organization hadn't just grown. It had rotted. Men like the one Mina described, the one with the jagged scar who laughed as he broke a woman's arm, were a cancer. They were the kind of animals his father would have purged without a second thought. Kaito felt a surge of genuine disgust, not just for the rogue soldier, but for his own detachment. He had allowed his territory to become a hunting ground for cowards who used his shadow to hide their own depravity. He shifted his gaze to Tony and Marco, his loyal sentinels. They remained stoic, but for the first time, Kaito wondered what they had seen and ignored in the name of collection and business. The status he wore so proudly suddenly felt like a heavy, stained shroud. He wasn't just a boss. He was a gatekeeper who had fallen asleep at his post. Kaito slowly reached out, his tattooed hand covering Mina's small fingers where they still clutched his tie. He didn't pull away. Instead, he tightened his grip, a silent vow passing between the Mafia boss and the child in the gray dress. The hunt would begin tonight, and it wouldn't be for profit or territory. It would be for the soul of the organization he had spent his life building, and for the justice Sora Park had been denied. Kaido stood up slowly, the movement causing a ripple of unease to spread across the restaurant. He didn't let go of Mina's hand. Instead, he guided her toward his table, placing her in the plush velvet chair he had just occupied. He signaled to the head waiter, who scrambled forward. "Get her whatever she wants," Kaido commanded, his voice like grinding stones. "And don't let her out of your sight." Turning to Tony and Marco, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. The luxury of the evening was over. The hunt had begun. "Bring me the manifests for the East Side collections from Tuesday," Kaido ordered, his eyes narrowing. Within minutes, he was back in the shadows of his private office, the glow of multiple monitors illuminating the dark ink on his neck. His silver watch ticked with agonizing precision as he tore through the digital logs of his own empire. Kaido didn't just look for names. He looked for the rot. He cross-referenced collection routes with the description Mina had provided, the jagged scar, the ringed hand, and the distinct, mocking laughter. His fingers, covered in tattoos that told stories of past wars, moved across the keyboard with a lethal intent. He pulled up the GPS data for every vehicle in his fleet, tracing the black sedans that had prowled near Sora Park's apartment complex 3 nights ago. The deeper he dug, the more the evidence pointed toward a crew led by a man named Juro, a mid-level enforcer who had been reporting record-breaking bonuses lately. Kaido realized with a sickening clarity that Juro wasn't just collecting for the organization. He was skimming off the top by terrorizing families for extra protection fees that Kaido had never authorized. The jagged scar described by Mina matched the file photo staring back at him from the screen. Juro had been using the dragon's name to hide a snake's greed. Kaido picked up his phone, his large ring clicking against the glass. "Every crew chief," he said into the receiver, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "Assemble at the docks. Warehouse 4. In 30 minutes. He glanced at the small monitor that showed Mina in the dining room, safely eating a bowl of fruit. He had spent 15 years building a reputation for order, but tonight, he would prove that the most dangerous thing in the city wasn't a rival gang. It was a boss who had finally seen the faces of his victims. The internal hunt was over. Now it was time for the purge. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and forgotten hope, a stark contrast to the scent of expensive cigars and aged whiskey that usually followed Kaido-chan. His presence in the sterile corridor was an anomaly. A man in a tailored black suit and a silk tie walking past weary nurses and flickering fluorescent lights. Every step he took in his polished leather shoes felt heavy, echoing against the linoleum floor as he approached room 412. He paused at the door, the silver watch on his tattooed wrist ticking away the seconds, before pushing it open with a hand that had signed off on countless collections, without ever seeing the consequences. Sora Park looked smaller than he had imagined. She lay in the center of the narrow hospital bed, her face a map of bruises that had blossomed into deep, ugly shades of purple and yellow. Her arm was encased in a thick white cast, elevated and immobile, a physical testament to the special work Juro's crew had performed in Kaido's name. As the door clicked shut, her eyes flew open, wide with a raw, visceral terror that Kaido usually only saw in the eyes of his enemies. She tried to pull away, her breath hitching in a panicked sob as she recognized the rugged, bearded face from the news and the whispers of the neighborhood. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracked and thin. "I told them. We don't have anything left." Kaido stood at the foot of the bed, his intimidating build casting a long shadow over her. For the first time in 15 years, he felt the suffocating weight of his own status. The rings on his fingers and the silk against his throat felt like a mockery in this room. He didn't speak immediately, he couldn't. He was too busy looking at the torn sleeve of her hospital gown and the way her good hand clutched the thin blanket as if it were a shield. This wasn't a business transaction or a territory dispute. This was a mother who had been broken by his neglect. "I didn't come for money, Sora," Kaido said, his voice dropping to a low, somber vibration that seemed to calm the frantic air in the room. He moved slowly, reaching out to place a business card on the bedside table, the simple white card with his private number. "Your daughter, Mina. She found me. She told me everything." As he watched the fear in her eyes slowly shift into a stunned, heart-wrenching confusion, Kaido realized that the damage to his reputation was nothing compared to the damage he had allowed to be done to his neighborhood. He turned toward the door, his jaw set in a hard, lethal line. The business he had built had become a monster, and seeing Sora Park's broken form had finally given that monster a face. He had seen enough. The internal purge wouldn't just be about order anymore. It would be about the blood that had been spilled on a Tuesday evening while he sat at a table of gold and glass. The air inside Warehouse 4 was thick with the scent of diesel and the stagnant chill of the river. Under the harsh glow of industrial work lights, 30 men stood in a loose semicircle, their shadows stretching long against the concrete floor. They shifted with a restless energy, a hum of low-voiced speculation vibrating through the ranks. Juro stood near the front, adjusting the cuffs of his leather jacket, a smug, expectant grin tugging at the corner of his mouth where a jagged scar broke the skin. They had seen Kaido's car pull up. They expected a reward for the record-breaking collections of the past month, a celebration of their rising status within the family. When Kaido finally stepped into the light, the hum died instantly. He didn't look like a man ready to celebrate. He walked with a heavy, rhythmic grace, his tailored black suit a stark contrast to the grimy surroundings. His dark hair was slicked back, and his beard was set in a hard, uncompromising line that made even the veteran lieutenants pull their shoulders back. The silver of his luxury watch caught a stray beam of light, ticking like a countdown that none of them could hear. He didn't stop until he was inches from Juro, his rugged build looming over the smaller man. Kaido didn't offer a greeting. Instead, he pulled a crumpled $5 bill from his pocket and held it up between two tattooed fingers. The men exchanged confused glances. The silence in the warehouse became a living thing, cold and suffocating. Kaido's gaze swept over the crowd, his eyes resting on each man with the weight of a death sentence. He wasn't looking at his soldiers. He was looking at the rot he had allowed to grow in his own backyard. The rings on his fingers caught the light as he slowly folded the bill, the sound of the paper crisp in the absolute stillness. "I spent 15 years building a name that meant something," Kaido began, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that echoed off the corrugated steel walls. "I built a kingdom where the innocent could walk the streets because the monsters were afraid of me." He turned his head slowly, the ink on his neck flexing. "But it seems some of you have forgotten who the monsters are supposed to be." Juro's smug grin faltered, his eyes darting to the exit as the realization began to sink in. This wasn't a promotion. The business they had been conducting in the shadows, the bruised knuckles and the broken families, had finally come back to haunt them. The tension reached a breaking point, a bowstring stretched until it groaned. Kaito leaned in, his breath cold against Juro's ear. "Tell me, Juro," he whispered, loud enough for every man in the room to hear. "Does a coward's laugh sound the same when the dragon is the one listening?" The damp air of the docks clung to Kaido's tailored suit as he stood before Juro, the silence of the gathered men heavy with the scent of salt and impending judgment. Kaido did not move quickly. He didn't have to. Every eye was fixed on the silver glint of his luxury watch as he slowly removed his ring, placing it in his pocket with a chilling deliberation. Juro's face was a mask of sweating terror, the jagged scar on his brow twitching as he looked for a mercy he knew he hadn't earned. The rogue soldier tried to speak, to offer an excuse about the bottom line and the necessity of fear. But Kaido silenced him with a single, sharp look that made the entire warehouse hold its breath. "You thought my name was a shield for your cowardice," Kaido said, his voice a low, lethal rasp that echoed off the metal crates. "You thought the ink on your skin gave you the right to break a mother's spirit while her child watched from the shadows." Kaido stepped into Juro's personal space, his rugged build dwarfing the man who had played king in the tenements. He didn't reach for a weapon. His hands, covered in dark, intricate tattoos, were more than enough to deliver the message. With a movement too fast for the eye to follow, Kaido's hand shot out, gripping the lapel of Juro's leather jacket, the same jacket Mina had described. He didn't strike him immediately. Instead, he forced Juro to look at the lieutenants, at the men who had been watching his success with envy. "Look at him," Kaido commanded the crowd, his voice booming through the docks. "This is not a soldier of the dragon. This is an animal who bit the hand that fed him by poisoning the ground we stand on." The justice was swift and public. Kaido didn't just strip Juro of his rank. He stripped him of his dignity, ensuring every man present understood that rule number 1 was written in blood that could not be washed away. When it was over, Juro was a broken heap on the cold concrete, a permanent reminder that Kaido's honor was not a relic of the past, but a living, breathing law. Kaido adjusted his silk tie, his breathing steady, his gaze turning toward the dark water of the river. The rot had been excised, but the debt to Sora and Mina Park was only half paid. He turned to Tony, the silver watch on his wrist catching a stray beam of moonlight. "Get the car," he said softly. "We have one more stop to make." The black Cadillac moved through the rain-slicked streets of the neighborhood. No longer a predatory shadow, but a guardian's vessel. When Kaido stepped back into the hospital room, the air seemed to settle around him. He moved with a quieted gravity, his rugged build no longer a threat, but a shield. Sora sat up in bed, her eyes red-rimmed and exhausted, but the raw terror that had greeted him hours ago had been replaced by a cautious, fragile hope. On the small plastic bedside table, Kaido placed a heavy, unmarked envelope. It contained enough to cover her medical expenses 10 times over, a reparations package for the collection that should have never happened. "The bills have been settled," Kaido said, his voice a low, steady vibration that filled the sterile room. "Every doctor, every therapist, every day you need to recover. It's already taken care of." He saw her good hand tremble as she reached for the envelope, her eyes searching his bearded face for a catch that wasn't there. Kaido leaned in slightly, the silver watch on his tattooed wrist catching the soft light of the heart monitor. "But this isn't just about the money, Sora. From this moment on, your name and Mina's name are etched into the stone of my territory." He spoke with the absolute authority of a man who had just purged his own ranks to prove a point. "No one, not my men, not the rival syndicates, not even the shadows, will ever cross your threshold again. You are under my personal protection. To touch you is to touch me." As if on cue, the door pushed open and Mina walked in, her gray dress slightly wrinkled but her expression bright. She looked at Kaido, then at the envelope, and finally at her mother's peaceful face. She didn't say a word. She simply walked over to the Mafia Boss and placed her small hand on top of his tattooed one. The rugged man, who had spent a lifetime demanding fear, found himself silenced by a child's gratitude. Kaido adjusted his silk tie, feeling the weight of the silver ring back on his finger, a ring that now stood for the honor he had reclaimed. He had spent years building a kingdom of fear, but as he looked at the Park family, he realized he had finally built something that could withstand the rot. He turned to leave, his polished shoes clicking softly on the linoleum, leaving behind a promise that would hold long after the bruises faded. The neighborhood would still fear the dragon, but for Sora and Mina, the dragon was the only reason they could finally sleep in peace. 10 years had passed, but the rhythm of the neighborhood had changed in ways only the observant could see. The air was still thick with the presence of Kaido-chan, but the suffocating fear had been replaced by a quiet, ironclad order. The black Cadillac remained a fixture on the corner of the east side, idling near the gates of the university with its engine purring like a resting beast. Inside the car, Kaito sat in the familiar dimness, the years having added a touch of silver to his beard and a deeper weight to his rugged gaze. He adjusted his silk tie, the same black silk that a small, trembling hand had once gripped in a desperate act of defiance. Across the street, a young woman moved through the crowd of students with an easy, unburdened confidence. It was Mina. She no longer wore the modest gray dress of a terrified child. She wore the bright colors of a girl with a future. Her long brown hair caught the morning sun as she laughed with a friend, her books held tight against her chest. She didn't look over her shoulder. She didn't scan the shadows for men with jagged scars. She moved through the world as if it were a place meant for her, a freedom bought by a man who had decided, a decade ago, that his name was worth more than his profit. Kaito watched her through the tinted glass, his tattooed hands resting steadily on the steering wheel. The silver luxury watch on his wrist ticked with a rhythmic grace, marking the time of a new era. He had spent his life as a predator, building walls of intimidation to keep the world at bay, but the pull of a tie had anchored him to something real. He had realized that a boss who rules only through fear eventually rules nothing at all. True power was the ability to ensure that a girl like Mina never had to know the names of the monsters under her bed. As Mina reached the entrance of the campus, she paused and looked toward the black sedan. She didn't wave, and he didn't roll down the window, but a silent acknowledgement passed between them in the morning air. It was a contract that required no crumpled $5 bills and no signatures, just the enduring legacy of a man who had found his soul in the grip of a 7-year-old's fingers. Kaito signaled to the driver, and the Cadillac pulled away from the curb, merging into the city traffic like a shadow. He was still the dragon, and the east side was still his kingdom, but the code had changed. He wasn't just maintaining territory anymore. He was guarding a peace he had once nearly helped destroy. As the car moved through the streets, Kaito touched the silver ring on his finger and smiled. The business of fear was over. The business of honor was just beginning.